Hello, I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale. I'm here today with Jessica Pliley, the co-chair of the GLC's Modern Slavery Working Group. We're sitting with Jessica to talk about the working group's origins and formation and purposes. Thanks for being here again, Jessica. Welcome back to Yale.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So this working group on modern slavery at an institute or a center at Yale, what is its purpose? How did we create this? And who's involved in it? What is the purpose of this working group?
Well, I think the purpose is to bring together a wide variety of scholars who are really leading this modern slavery studies field that is emerging. People have been looking into modern slavery for the last 20 years. And 10 years ago, there was just a handful of scholars, usually from different disciplinary backgrounds, who are writing about the problems of forced labor, the problems of what has been called modern slavery and trafficking. And since then, there has just been an absolute flowering of scholarship. To the degree that it's difficult to keep up with it. And the scholarship has emerged in different disciplinary silos and has been supported by different institutions. And what we wanted to do was to bring together all of those different silos to see kind of what the state of the field is. What are the questions driving it? What are some of the controversies?
Did this start largely as a did the field start largely as a concern with the contemporary problem of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, as it exploded like after the Cold War? I mean, is that what brought this study about, even though now it has many disciplines involved?
Yeah, I think that different scholars come to this field through different paths. So they might be looking at immigration policy. They might be looking at labor rights and organizing. They might be looking at human rights norms. We can, and people often do, attribute the origins to Kevin Bales's well-known book, Disposable People, and he's written several others that got quite a bit of press coverage and raised a lot of awareness about these issues. Now, Bales's work isn't without its own controversies, as he's been,
even within the working group.
Yeah, I mean, he's been the subject of a lot of critiques for his approach.
But he did forge the question as
an
international dilemma and got great attention to it.
Exactly, and I think that that's one of the things that must be acknowledged, and it's one of the reasons why we invited him to be part of our conversations in our group. We're looking at kind of forging connections across the different approaches and the different disciplinary
Well, let's name
divisions.
some of the disciplines and maybe even a few people. There are 13 or 14 members of the group. They're from at least 3 continents. We have people from Australia, South Africa, the UK, and the US. Do I have that right? And in that cluster of people, we have all sorts of scholars and activists.
Right.
In what fields?
Okay, so my co-organizer, Geneviève LeBaron, and I really wanted to be broad in our approach, but we also do have our own biases that we bring to the table. I'm a historian, so it was important to me to make sure that the humanities were well represented. So we have a handful of historians and people from English. Then we also have people from business, we have people from international law, people from political science.
And by business, you mean Andrew Crane, who's actually a professor of business.
Exactly. And looks at business ethics and corporate social responsibility.
Which is a huge part of this story.
And also tracking the supply chain question, which Genevieve's work does as well. For international law, we brought in Jean Alain, who has been a contributor to many of the UN discussions about forced labor, and he helped kind of forge the Bellagio guidelines for the definition of slavery. We also have Janie Cheng, who is at American University and was involved in the creation of the 2000 Palermo Protocol, which is the United Nations governing international agreement on trafficking and modern slavery.
So we've got people who are not only scholars using archives and data, but people who've actually been involved at some of the highest levels in developing international protocol, ways of studying this problem, because the problem, isn't it, is one that seems, when you really realize it, seems so intractable. There are millions of people in some way or another involved in some kind of traffic. They're being trafficked. They're involved in labor, slavery, or sex slavery. There are many different definitions of what that actually is or what that means, but it's a vast international problem that goes across, it seems, almost any border, including into the United States. But it requires this diverse kind of crowd of people to actually even make sense of it. Because an economist would go find one thing, but a historian can find its roots. And that's kind of what you guys were after here in conceiving who would be part of this. It's hard to select, who gets to be part of our working group, but you and Genevieve did it.
Yeah, we were interested in hitting about 4 major nodes of scholars. So in the UK, there's been some emerging scholars who are really looking at more methodologically rigorous research. And so we were interested in inviting those types of social scientists who are really questioning the way that the numbers get produced that are celebrated by the ILO or Walk Free or the United Nations.
And the very nature of the data is at stake.
Yes, and is in itself politicized in really interesting ways.
Without which it's hard to make claims about how vast this problem is.
And I think that many of us, the people in the group have very diverse opinions and kind of perspectives on these issues. But I think most of us would agree that there is absolutely a need for more rigorous research. And that given all the different ways of counting, ethnography seems to be the best approach. It's one of the reasons why we invited Elena Shih, who is a very exciting young scholar at Brown University.
And was also a fellow here at our center.
She was indeed, yeah. And her research provides a really nice model of kind of what we see as best practices. So yeah, even if we don't agree as a group on all, what is the definition? Should all?
We didn't expect you to all agree. That was part of the point, wasn't it?
What practices fit under the umbrella of modern day slavery is something that we could debate,
and have.
And we do for hours and hours and hours. Everything from forced marriage to debt bondage. It's a hugely large, complicated
when is a laborer enslaved and when is a laborer's life stunted and when is a low wage, almost slavery? It's a very difficult thing to define.
The one thing that we seem to have landed on as a group as well is the absolute essential nature of empowering workers themselves to help formulate solutions. That is something that through our discussions and through our debates has emerged. And I think that is spoken to in the theme of our conference that's going to be the capstone of our time together in November. What works, what helps, what works in terms of fighting the exploitation that is associated with modern slavery and trafficking.
What kinds of activism work, what kinds of research work. And I want to back up just a bit to why the GLC even does working groups. Well, the model for working groups is very old, and we've done working groups on numerous kinds of subjects. I think this is the 4th or 5th one we've done. But our perception was, particularly from a conference we did 4 or 5 years ago on modern slavery, one of the first such big academic conferences on this subject, was that there was a great deal of activism out there in the world. There were NGOs studying or working on this and working on that, and they were doing intervention all over the world of one kind and another. But there wasn't much research. Although there was research being done, a lot of the activist groups weren't reading it. And that really was the impetus, especially when we created fellowships in modern slavery, and you were the first. And we realized that there's this work going on out there. Let's get a group of people together who are doing the most cutting edge research, or at least some small portion of them, and see what kind of research base we can actually create for this huge problem in the world. And I say that in part because my own vision for this Gilder Lehrman Center has, over time, become the idea of taking what a great research university like this one can do out to the world. To go out and study the world, but also to take what we can create in the way of knowledge out to the world. And I think that's part of where the impetus for this came from, because all of you in this group are one part scholar and one part activist because of the nature of the subject. And sometimes you feel like the scholar first, because you have to be, and sometimes you have to speak up as the activist as well. We wanted to blend those in a way that could take knowledge out to the world. And I hope that's what you're doing.
Well, and I think that that is one of the major purposes of the working group. It's difficult because as much as we want to advocate and celebrate really, really rigorous research, one of the things is that many of the people who perform and conduct that research often aren't trained in how to communicate that research then to a general population.
Right.
And the thing is the general public includes the activists who are working within the field. I mean, they do not read the research, the most cutting edge research, because they don't have the time, quite frankly. And so there's got to be a way for us to be able to communicate our findings in more digestible, talking points, and so that it reaches not only activists and people who are working in the field and practitioners and service providers, but also legislators, because legislators and state representatives often have very little understanding of what the research is showing.
And they have even less time. I mean,
exactly.
They read even less than the NGO director.
Right.
Getting a congressman or a legislator to read your work is might be a fool's errand, but at least the NGO people who are actually active in this field, we wanted to reach them. And so let's talk a little bit about what the working group is actually doing, reading each other's work, workshopping each other's work, but then also planning a major conference which will occur next November. I think it's November 2nd, 3rd of 2018 here at Yale, on this whole big problem of what is modern slavery and where is it. So what does a working group actually do? What does a working group of a bunch of scholars do when they get together for 2.5 days in New Haven?
Well, I think that this is, so you could probably answer that question better than I, since this is my first sustained engagement with one. But really, because of the structure of universities in general, that we really don't talk to one another very often. So I think the real value of a working group is that you put people in a room, you hopefully put all the iPhones and computers aside, and you get people really talking across their disciplinary boundaries. And you expose them to different approaches to the same topic. And once that happens, then conversation just grows, and there are connections that are made, and definitions that need to be refined, and so forth and so on. And it can be
arguments that emerge.
Yes, and it's incredibly dynamic. And then the question becomes, okay, so that's great for the 12 to 13 people who are in the room, but then how do we produce something that can go beyond the room? And
well, you started with a technique. I think it was your idea, but correct me if I'm wrong, that I believe it was the first gathering of this group, you had people pair off across disciplines, and they had to literally interview each other. Or they had to get a take on the other person's work. They had to read the other person's work, interview the person, and then come back in, and we had to explain someone else's work. Now, that we surely don't ever do in the academy. We just tell people what we do.
Exactly, and it was an incredibly effective exercise.
It was.
And
where'd you learn that, in camp or something?
No, but I used it in my classroom occasionally to get people to pay attention to one another. And it's funny. I often joke around that sometimes academics really the best way of getting them to work together is to use the tools that we use with our students with them, because we're all just lifelong students. And what was so charming about that exercise is how nervous people got about hearing their work being presented by another scholar.
It was truly nerve-wracking.
Yeah, but it was also
someone I didn't even know.
Right.
Grace Delgado, in my case, because she is a historian.
She is a historian.
Yeah, that's right. But she was, and it was, if I say so myself, it was an amazing take on my work. But anyway, go.
Yeah, I mean, here you have one of the leading borderlands historians who is analyzing your work on race and the Civil War and so forth. And
who knew?
But
So what about this conference?
Right.
When in the fall we're bringing, I don't know, 20 to 25 people here for a 2.5 day conference, out of which we also hope to produce a book you're planning.
Yes.
So let's talk at least about those two things and how
Okay.
you've conceived it.
Well, let me go back to that issue of the other notes that we're drawing upon,
yeah,
because it's reflected in the conference. So I mentioned we can think of the first note about the question of methodology emerging from the University of Sheffield and a British Academy project that Genevieve ran. There's also the Open Democracy group that is kind of based all over the world, but that Open Democracy Beyond Slavery
With a big website.
has an extraordinary website, and Genevieve was one of the founders of it. Joel Quirk, who's another working group member, is a current
You've
editor.
written for it.
Yeah, almost everybody in our group
I
has
think everybody
contributed to it. And so we wanted to bring in somebody who's represented that group. Then there's also the Rights Lab at Nottingham University that's being run by Zoe Trod and Kevin Bales. So we needed, we wanted their voices represented. And then who else is there? There's, the Historians Against Slavery.
Yes.
And so
Which is a U.S.-based group.
well, not only, because there's now a UK chapter,
That's
but
right.
it's historians of slavery who are taking on this contemporary issue and bringing in their historical analysis to light or to bear on this issue.
Which is an unusual move for historians.
It is. It's somewhat uncomfortable at times, but I do think that we have something to say.
The present? Who does the present?
Yeah. And then there's a group that I'm affiliated with, which is called also a historians group called Trafficking Past. It's being funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK that is looking at questions of women's clandestine migration for intimate labor. And so that's a fancy way of saying sex trafficking, but not only sex trafficking, also domestic labor, women who move for marriage and various other things. And so those were the nodes we really wanted to tap into for the working group. And then some of those nodes are reflected in who we invited for the conference. Now, the conference really is focused, we do not want to get mired down into the debate of what constitutes modern slavery, what constitutes trafficking.
That fight's been had.
That fight has been had. It has not necessarily been resolved. I think it's an important debate.
No clear winner yet.
Not at all. But the stakes of that particular debate aren't necessarily generative. And so we're more interested in what types of interventions work and what type of kind of research works, and we have a much more pragmatic and practical take with this conference. And so the people who we've invited reflect that. We're interested in showcasing, of course, the voices of the working group because they are such a dynamic set of researchers, but also bringing in other people as well. And so we have one panel that's about kind of narrative and the role of storytelling in discussing and raising awareness about exploitation and emancipation and so forth. We have one, I'm trying to remember them all, but we have one panel on race and the aftermath of slavery, because this is one of the biggest issues within the field of modern slavery and trafficking is the way that it erases race. And it erases particularly the racial foundation of chattel slavery, which of course we all know is the foundation of modern capitalism. And so we want to be very careful and very aware of the way that erasure does particular violence to certain communities. And then we also have a panel on market-based solutions, which is the new thing within kind of neoliberal problem solving is, the market will solve it through corporate social responsibility or through cleaner supply chains. And
you can just get Apple to
Right.
bear down on all those places they make an iPhone.
Right, then we'll all feel better about having
They'll solve
iPhones,
it,
and the laborers will be, and so forth and so on. So, so we are bringing some people in who research supply chains, which is a fascinating area of research. It's also very, very difficult to conduct that research for outside
You have to
researchers.
go into the field, and often in places you're not welcome.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's the kind of work Genevieve LeBaron does.
Exactly. It's extraordinary, the type of research that's coming out on supply chains, and it is a critical question. So it should be a really dynamic conference. We do have quite a few activists and practitioners and people who are working in the field. joining us.
Well, see, we're going to do it again. That is what we did 5 years ago, or maybe it's 6 years ago now. We're going to mix the activists with the scholars, but this time we hope an outcome that keeps them much, much more in communication and reading each other,
right.
And following each other. And I guess I would just get you to reflect with me once more on what we're really up to here. We've really brought a research institute devoted to the study of slavery and its destruction across all borders and all time. In other words, a historical problem into the present, using history, but into the present, where we realize once again that this primal problem of human exploitation is as old as humanity. It's as old as every civilization on the planet. It recurs, particularly after great historical transformations, perhaps like the end of the Cold War, like the growth of globalization, which predates the end of the Cold War. There are all kinds of causes and turning points in this. But here we are again talking about the capacity of human societies and individual humans to exploit other people. And if a Center for the Study of Slavery doesn't do that, then what's it doing? You know, that I think is the essential purpose here, or goal. And what we've done is to try to find, and we got lucky in finding people like you and Genevieve, and then all the others in this working group. I think at least half of whom have been fellows at our center at one time or another, to come together and figure this out. That is how, at least, to collectively study this. Not that you're going to come up with all the great solutions that the United Nations will announce to the world, and this problem will be defeated by, what is it, 2030? Who established that goal, by the way?
The UN.
The UN, that's right.
Yeah,
it was the UN that said by 2030 we were going to end modern slavery.
Yeah, it's one of the sustainable development goals.
Yeah.
Right. It's
getting close.
It's very close, and
I don't know if we're gonna.
Yeah, I think that you would have to interview. There are other people in our working group who are much more optimistic about our ability to hit that. I mean, I think my background as a historian makes me a little caustic or cynical at times.
Well, remember this came up in I believe the first gathering of the group, and we historians spoke up and said, "Whoa, wait a minute."
Yeah.
You know, ending something by when? You don't know what's going to happen.
Well, I also think
history's not predictable.
Well, and I think that one of the benefits, I mean, there's two things I would say, is that in the field of, by bringing historians and people from the humanities into this, we can theorize different forced labor situations that happened after traditional emancipation, like here in the United States after 1865. So we can think about prison labor. We can look at the history of convict labor, of
what happened in the British Empire after the end of slavery.
Right. But one of the things that we can do when we look at these discrete cases of forced labor is we can see the ways that policies helped to develop them and sustain them, and how they can be eradicated. So even though I tend to be somewhat pessimistic about the sustainable development goals, I do think that historians and other scholars from the humanities have an optimistic message that we know that these things can be impacted, they can be eradicated by shifts in policy, by shifts in implementation, and so forth and so on. So, I mean, there is a bit of a hopeful message.
Sure.
But I also think that one of the things that particularly Genevieve and I wanted to do is we met the year that she was the modern day slavery fellow here at the GLC. And we realized what a great, how do I want to say this? How dynamic the fellowship was in terms of providing opportunities, and that there were several people who had been fellows that we wanted a way to kind of connect a through line to understand the institutional importance of the
social
fellowship.
Scientists, historians.
Right, and the Gilder Lehrman Center.
We had one playwright who was our fellow
Yeah.
for a year. I mean,
So this was a way to, in a sense, celebrate the foundation of the fellowships, and to show kind of more publicly what they contribute to these larger conversations. So
well, that for a historian, that's a good hopeful note. I mean, I'm with you on that. Well, I remember, just for one last thing, I don't know if it was the first working group meeting or some other place, we got to thinking about, so if modern slavery is supposed to be ended by 2030, where are we in this process? And then you go back and start searching for historical analogies, and they never work, although it's fun to do it. You know, we can't help it. I mean, I remember, I think I proposed the groups try to imagine that it's 1850 in the United States or it's 1845 in the United States. What audacity you would have to even conceive of the idea that slavery would be ended in 15 to 17 years. I mean, although there was an abolition movement crusading to do just that, pushing against history, and that's kind of what's happening in the world now. We're just trying to bring, you know, knowledge and scholarship to that process. So.
It is, and I think that, you know, that in itself is a very hopeful note that we need the bold thinkers. On the other hand, I think that there's a really important difference between the jurisdictional nature of chattel slavery and the practices that we're describing, which are not so easily solved.
Which is one of the things you learn in this field, that it's not the same as chattel slavery. It's many different kinds of exploitation. Well, listen, thank you. This has been a great at least brief discussion of what this working group is all about and why we have fellowships in modern slavery. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you.